Welcome to 5, the 5 reading group, as well as chapter 5 of 5. We're here with Barak, who's doing a reading tonight, slightly interactive, but definitely mostly interactive after he finishes up. And I believe there's a bit of a content warning for this evening's chapter. There's some adult themes, horror, I believe.
The name of the chapter is Horror.
Okay, so anybody watching, this is your moment to opt out if that is at all triggering for you. Otherwise, we are very excited to hear the next chapter, and this is an interlacing chapter. So this is one of the chapters that sheds light on a smaller part of the story. It is not part of one of the main characters. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's a critical event at a time and place, if you will. In this case, it's a few events, but describing things that are not directly our protagonists, of which there are 5, and one of the reasons the book is named that way. But this is, again, I just love the little analogy you came up with, the light bulb that revolves around the room. So this is one of those corners or parts of the tapestry that I'm showing to you without any reason as to why I'm showing it to you, but it will become clear down the road why that really, really mattered.
Hope springs eternal.
Right. And the content warning, thank you for that. I mean, we touched on infanticide, we touched on racism, so this one is kind of a little bit adult themed. And hopefully my accent is not going to ruin it like it did last time with my reading of Mother in UDDR.
I think it'll be okay.
Yeah, well, I think we'll be fine. Exactly. And so 5, 5th chapter, and title is Whore. She liked working at the Classy Lassie. The name was abhorrent, of course. Who calls any establishment of ill repute or otherwise that kind of name? But the owners apparently thought it was clever, for some reason lost to centuries of history. He was the very same person who owned the Steadfast Inn nearby, so it made a kind of sense. Plus, he was a dwarf, and unlike elves, dwarfs rarely change their opinion about something unless they had to. So the name stuck. They held on to it steadfast, she remembers amusing herself at some point. In reality, though, the Lassie had no business being where it was. It was far too nice of a place to belong in the shallows. This was another reason that merchants often stopped by, even if many people refused to admit it. They would say it was the lower landing fees or that they had business in the shallows. Come on, nobody had business in the shallows. It was not that kind of district. But seeing as how the Lassie got almost as much business as did the Steadfast, it was pretty obvious what the real reason was for so many ships docking. Follow the money, as they say. Indeed, the Lassie was, well, classy. The rooms were kept in good condition, for one thing, and the bed sheets were changed daily, just like they were at the inn. This was practically unheard of for a whorehouse, since sheets were expensive and in such an environment especially challenging to clean. But the owners insisted, not always with a straight face, that it was a way to keep customers coming. And they came, and they came, and they kept on coming. The hostesses, there were typically a couple of hosts as well, but it was mostly hostesses, were paid well too. She had heard many stories from many other girls from all over the country about how in these places you would end up making just enough to live on, but no more. You certainly weren't taking a cut of your earnings. And you were expected to work all the time, except usually when you had your period, although some customers would pay extra for that. At the Lassie, the owner kept only 3/4 of the take for himself and even paid the expenses for pricey upkeep, like those bed sheets. He also provided free food and lodging for the girls. The other quarter went straight to the hostesses. So not only was the Lassie a high lass, as the owners sometimes said, again, barely keeping a straight face, sort of place to visit, it was similarly a great place of employment. It was safe and clean, and they even got a day off every week. As you might imagine, it wasn't easy to get hired there. Whenever an opening was made available, perhaps because a girl decided that she had earned enough to try and start a new life somewhere, something that happened fairly often at the Lassie and pretty much nowhere else that she had ever heard of, word seemed to travel extremely fast. And the next morning, they would have 20 girls at the door clamoring for the spot. This also made for good business because the owners could be very picky, and they had a good eye for it too. The kind of girls you would spend time with at the Lassie were unusually pretty, and not one of them had any blemish. If you were going to spend the mind-bogglingly enormous sums they charged, then there was no better place where you could spend them. They even threw in free breakfast at the Steadfast Inn. During her first stint at the Lassie, when it was still fairly new and much more like any other whorehouse, she remembers the owner viewing her with a mixture of appreciation and suspicion. It wasn't famous then, and the owner, who was trying to establish its presence in the shallows, was trying to figure out an edge over the competition. It wasn't too long ago. 200 years, perhaps. What's your name again, lass? Layera, she lied, calmly. He looked at her up and down again. I have to say, you do look nice. How old did you say you were? 280, she lied, again. He squinted. Well, assuming you're being more or less straight with me, I suppose that's old enough for an elf, he said. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, you sure are pretty, though. Thank you, she responded casually. He took a breath. But why would you want to work at a whorehouse? She levered her face at him. Looking for new stuff to do, she said, then added casually, I'm bored. That first stint lasted 14 years. Lavatown was an interesting place, and she spent a fair bit of her free time checking things out. And it was during that time that she and the owner reached some of the understandings that eventually transformed into the successful policies that made it a house not of ill, but instead of high repute. She remembered the evening when she walked casually over to his office in the Steadfast to tell him she was leaving. Not that just any girl could walk over casually to see him, but she could. He looked at her with a mixture of sadness, fondness, and concern. Oh boy, he said, you're our anchor piece, you know that, right? She nodded. What am I going to do without you? Our reputation is dependent upon you. He looked genuinely worried. Don't worry, Bhavin, you'll be fine, she assured him. How can you say that? The place might well be called the Exotic Elven Lady, he exclaimed. Mayhaps, but I have some ideas for you. And so they entered into a long conversation about how to retain and maintain not just clientele, but high quality staff. By the time they ended, she had a bonus of 10 gold in her palm from a very grateful dwarf. That was a truly massive sum, more than enough for her to gain passage on one of the caravans heading back to Koranta City, and there to acquire the supplies and especially the expensive gear that she needed to go on a prolonged adventure. The amount also told her something even more important. Dwarves were known for many things, but being generous with their gold was not one of them. They had become friends. When she came back to Lavatown some 60 years later, the Lassie was already developing its reputation beyond the borders of the increasingly important burgeoning port city. The city that lay so improbably on top of a mostly submerged volcano in the middle of an ocean. She looked him up. He kept the same office at the Steadfast Inn. And he had kept his promise. The password they had agreed on amongst the two of them was not forgotten and was relayed to whichever captain was in charge of the security staff, generation of humans after another. Bhavin liked his entire guard to be made of humans and half-orcs and other short-lived races, she recalled. Secrets pass with them, he used to tell her in confidence. Learning the password was part of the ritual of becoming captain still didn't make it any less shocking to the current one when she said it to him. Layera! The owner jumped from his chair and rushed over to hug her, awkward as that gesture was considering their rather differing statures. She found it endearing, if not unexpected, considering that he was a dwarf. That in almost a century of knowing each other, he never once challenged her to reveal her real age or her real name. He looked much older now. You look good, Bhavin, well preserved. How are you, old friend? She said to him after he managed to get his face out of her bosom. He looked up at her. Well preserved indeed. Oh, joy to see you and blessings be upon you. Have you come for a visit? Tell me of your travels. And so she did. And they spent dinner together and went on with drinks well into the night. She had to admit that the Steadfast had substantially improved its selection of available ales and wines and top shelf elixirs. Then she told him that she was looking to spend some time in Lavatown. Her second stint at the Classy Lassie lasted even longer than the first one. Why wouldn't it? As soon as she stated her intent, the owner gave her the best room all to herself and allowed her to keep her own schedule. She ended up working 4 days a week. And they had a special arrangement in which they split the take right down the middle. She knew that he would give her even more if she asked for it, but she liked him and didn't want to create any resentment. He still paid for the expenses. A couple of years in, she started overseeing some of the other girls and trained them in the arts of the courtesan. After about 10 years of doing that, she ended up not hosting much at all, unless she really felt like it, which still happens sometimes. Instead, managing the lassie itself and all of the girls. And Bhavin gave her 10% of his own share, which came out to way more than she'd ever made before. Enough that only 10 years later, she bought a place up in the third shelf district of Green Park, high up towards the lip of the volcano. It was a beautiful district, full of massively tall trees and small houses, many of them nestled in between the huge tree branches. Her tiny house overlooked the efficient and tidy farm extending from the volcano's core, where, due to the Green Park's favorable sun exposure, the local specialty crops were grown. Unsurprisingly, a fair number of half-elves and even a couple of full ones lived in those trees. And she was delighted to be part of that community, even as nobody had any idea of what sort of business let her buy her way in. Elves, after all, lived long enough, 1,000 years was not unheard of, that if one of them set their mind to it, they were usually able to accumulate enough resources over time to buy a place pretty much anywhere they liked, regardless of where they started. The only reason this didn't lead to wars of total annihilation by the shorter-lived races was that the elves' massive lifespan was offset by their tremendously low fertility rates, and that their resulting tendency, seeing as how the death of one was therefore so much more tragic, to stick to their own. She loved her life in Green Park District, but secretly, she had to admit that the lassie felt like home. Eventually, her wanderlust took her away for another decade or two, and so her third, short, and final stint at the lassie came after that. But that is a story for another time.
So what did we interlace together?
It's a good question.
Well, you're learning a little bit more about the city,
World building.
right? So you're kind of getting more glimpses into what we're talking about. Where are we? We're in a,
It's like a port city or a connecting city.
and it's sitting in the middle of a volcano,
There's a volcano,
that's
yeah.
submerged in the ocean. Very weird stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so you're starting to get a little bit of the strangeness of what is this place. And I'm talking about districts that are placed on shelves that are somehow sticking from the volcano, right?
Yeah,
I'm hoping that you're starting to get a little bit of that sense that this is a very unusual place.
You mentioned the lip of the volcano, and I was like, wait a second, where on the volcano are we?
I heard the lip of volcano, yeah.
So you'll get to that. We will get to that, but right now it's the teasers, right? So it's a little bit of filling in a little bit more towards the center of the tapestry, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I am taking some of these foundations that everybody's familiar with in order
Yeah,
to
Harry
give you
Potter's
some
name,
grounding,
the
right?
Mugger, yeah.
Build on them.
But yeah, so that's the story of the elvish whore, who plays a really important role in this book, but you won't hear about her for a while.
I really like the idea of elven horrors, just because coming from like a very deep D&D background lore, I always think of elves as like the high elves as being like this holier than thou, you know, like they're like the Aryan race of like the
Right.
mystical creatures, like you can get no better, you can get no higher.
Mhm.
And so to think of like an elf being a whore is actually really kind of cool to turn that on its head, because generally that's not their thing. You know, like that is beneath them. They would be a courtesan, right? They would be a courtier to a king or something like that, but never like in a whorehouse. And so I like this world that these characters are inhabiting.
Right. By the way, this is interesting. So thank you for picking up on that, because on the last session, Greg picked up on the Thor
Yeah,
that he's used to,
yeah,
but my Thor is very different than the Thor he's used to, but I'm still using the word Thor. So it kind of it gives the grounding, and at the same time, you're not fully stable on your feet, right?
yeah.
Similarly with that, you will see there's a
Yeah.
chapter coming up in 2 chapters. So the next interlacing one called Werewolf, where again, I'm using a very well-known term, werewolf, but then probably within 2 paragraphs, you'll realize, oh, that's different.
Yeah.
right? So it's familiar and different. And I mentioned it, I think last time. It's in service to the listener, right? I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to like make it so distant and weird that you're like put off. But at the same time, this is a weird world. So
Yeah,
it's an attempt. That's what I'm trying to do.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. I like it. I like it. I like turning those constructs that people have, sort of turning it around and having people look at it in a different way, because it helps me check my bias about elves. I also love dwarves. That's why I named my car after a dwarf. So I'm very partial to the dwarven race.
And you'll notice that there's actually the chapter coming up called Nael. And she's also an elf. And you will find, because that one is a protagonist perspective, all sorts of other things that will sort of turn the elf concept, like you were saying, will turn the elf concept a little bit more on its head, or perhaps explain things that are I think messed up in the way we think about elf.
All right, so we are concluding our discussion, and looking forward to 2 weeks from now, same time, same Barak channel, and we will hear about Nael,
Nael, yeah.
and we'll see how things go from there.